my name's Sarah Woolley and I'm the General Secretary of the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union. So our trade union represents food workers in the UK, so everything from producing to delivering, serving food, and all the little intricate jobs in between. We've got members that work in places such as Greggs. They make Fox's biscuits, cakes, bread, all the really nice stuff that's really good for you. That's a treat our members make, as well as salads and ready-made sandwiches. My role as General Secretary is kind of the leader of the union. There's a lot of legislative responsibilities in the role, but it's typically to be the voice and to talk about the issues that our members face. And I used to work for Greggs before I became an employee for the union.
Mm-hmm. And so the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union, what are its main goals and how are they going about to achieve these?
Okay, so our main goals are to improve the lives of people working in the food industry, you know, better pay, better terms and conditions, safer working environments. It's a work in progress. We're 175 years old, or 176 this year, and as the industry develops, the issues that our members face on a day-to-day basis develop as well, and obviously you have things thrown in like COVID that nobody was expecting, and we've had to deal with that and learn how to protect people that had to work throughout all that as well. Other things that we're campaigning for currently are the removal of zero-hours contracts, which is a workplace contract that doesn't guarantee you any hours week to week. We've got a big campaign around that, around the right to food. So a lot of our members through the pandemic struggled to afford to feed themselves and their families. They were running out of food between paydays. So we're doing a big piece of work around what needs to change in the food industry and in government to make sure that everybody has got access to decent, nutritious food, and just rebuilding the membership and growing.
Mm.
So how are you going about trying to change the 0 hours contract?
So that's been a long-term project. Back before I became a paid official, I spoke outside Parliament around the need to remove 0 hours contracts out of the world. With difficulty, in all honesty. They originally started kind of in the entertainment sectors for freelance workers to be able to use more than one contract at a time, but what we found these days is they're in the food industry, they're in the education sector, they're in the rail industry, you know, and you can be an architect and be on a 0 hours contract. They're kind of rife throughout the whole of the UK economy. And what we're trying to say is, if you need somebody week in, week out coming into work and doing 10, 15, 20, however many hours, then they should be on a contract for that and not for one that can ultimately just say no. We had a big break last week, so the European Human Rights Commission have come to an agreement with McDonald's around sexual harassment, because not only is 0 hours contracts an issue for workers being able to afford to pay the rent or even set up a mobile phone contract, they're quite exploitative and develop quite a toxic culture of bullying, because if you upset your manager, they are kind of in control of how many hours that you get, because they don't have to give you any. So what we found is one of the things in McDonald's, for example, is a sexual harassment and misogynistic culture where managers are kind of bullying specific workers and not giving them hours as a punishment, if you like, for not doing, you know, whatever they've asked.
And so you spoke a little bit about how your goals develop as the working industry as a whole develops. So at the moment, food insecurity is one of the greatest challenges that our world faces today. And so as someone working to reduce this, what are your thoughts on how we can address this?
So one thing that we did after we did our Right to Food survey was we set up what we've called a food and work network, and there's a website, it's form.org.uk. And basically what we've got is a bunch of academics that are doing some fantastic work around food insecurity, the impact of poverty on, you know, child health and mental health and physical health. trade unions like ours that are working around the right to food, and voluntary organisations that are doing similar. And we're looking at the food industry now in the UK and internationally, what needs to change, what research has been already done, where there's gaps in research, and how we move forward. So for example, we've had a full day session on food banks. You know, they're there in the UK, they've increased in number over the last 10 years. The model for somebody walking in can be quite, feeling ashamed that they're having to be there. There's got to be a better way than queuing up with a ticket to get a bag of food that actually you might not even be able to use. One thing that came out of a discussion a couple of weeks ago was in areas where there's, for example, a big African population, giving them tins of baked beans is not something that they're going to then go home and think, right, I'll cook with that, because that's not what they eat, what they cook with on a general basis. So we've been talking around, kind of community kitchens and larders, making employers more accountable. So if there's food waste, what are they doing with that food waste? Why is it going in the bin? Why is it not being put to a worker cooperative, for example, that's producing food for a community? So we're kind of 12 months into it, and we're a lot further forward than we were 12 months ago, but there's still a lot of work to do, because one thing we don't want to do is fix the problem in the UK, but then elsewhere in the world make a bigger problem, because we've only looked at a little aspect of the whole supply chain.
You talked a little bit about food wastage now. So would you say that it's a relationship between food wastage and providing food for other people? And would you say that the UK, as a more economically developed country, really needs to be held accountable for this?
Yeah, I think there's billions of tonnes a year of food that goes to waste that could be utilised, I used to work for Greggs, so they used to send all their spare food, waste food in the shops to kind of pig farms for pig feed. Over the last 10 years, they've developed a process now where more of that food goes to food banks, or they've developed what we fondly call second shops, that are outlet shops, so it goes into the shops and it's sold the next day for a lot cheaper price. That's just one example of a company trying to reduce the amount of waste that they throw away, but there's so much more that can be done. So I know kind of the supermarkets in France, they've got rules around their food, and we don't have that yet over in the UK. There's still a lot around, well, this says this tomato's used by the 1st of March, so I can't use it on the 2nd. There's still a lot of education, I think, to go around that as well, because as much as employers having a responsibility, we as consumers have to.
You mentioned some of the criticism that labour unions get. So some critics argue that unions in general are anti-employer, and that union contracts make it more difficult for companies to fire unproductive employees. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, that is something that we hear about a lot. I think the goal is, and both employer and trade union want people in employment until they retire. Nobody wants people to be out of work. We don't always agree on how to get them there, and employers concentrating, people say quite rightly so, on making profit and the business being profitable. We want our workers to work, our members to be workers that are in safe, well-paid environments. Does that make it more expensive? There's an argument to say yes. If people are paying higher wages, then yes, it comes off the profits of the employer. But actually, if you've got a worker in an unsafe environment that has an accident, that's potentially going to cost that employer tens and thousands of pounds. So surely it's safer and more productive to have trade unions there to prevent that from happening. I can't remember what you said for the second question, sorry, second part of it.
That it makes it more difficult for companies to fire unproductive employees. I
think on that kind of question, it's not around making things more difficult, it's about ensuring there's a fair process. So, what an employer might see somebody as being unproductive just because they're a woman at pregnancy age, or that they're a foreign national rather than a British national in the UK, or that they just don't like the look of them, that's not a fair process. It's not necessarily that they're unproductive, or they might not have even been trained properly. So it's about making sure there's a fair and consistent process, no matter who you are, what your background is, how long you've been in a company, that if there's an issue it's sorted and not just your face doesn't fit so you're out, which can make it more difficult, but we should be living in a fair society.
As a trade union leader yourself, how do you react to the new levels of industrial action that have taken the UK by storm recently?
I think it's a long time coming. So I mentioned in the presentation, there's more industrial action in the last 12 months than there's probably been in the UK since I've been alive. So I'm 35, so the miners' strike was probably the last time we had such a big wave. And I think what's happened is a lot of these workers for a number of years have not received a pay rise. So they were told through the pandemic that they were key workers, and we went out on a Thursday evening and clapped them for getting us through the pandemic. And then when we're in a cost of living crisis and inflation's rocketing and they're saying, look, we need better wages, being told no. And there's a lot of frustration around the fact that, certainly from a government point of view, they've spent millions and millions and millions of pounds on things through COVID that haven't worked, yet the workers that have literally kept the wheels turning in the UK, they're telling them there's not enough money to pay them better wages so they can feed the families and pay the bills. So I think it's good, it's disruptive, but I think it's good that people are starting to come together and fight back, and the public are also recognising that too.
Would you say the pandemic catalysed this new wave of industrial action?
I think, I'm not sure, to be honest. I think the pandemic has certainly got people reevaluating their worth. A lot of the countries shut down for a long period of time, and groups of workers were having to actively go into work every day. Our members, for example, were going into food factories with hundreds of other workers. And doing that and being paid minimum wage, for example, has got people thinking, well, actually, I'm worth more than this. So in that respect, possibly yes. But I think it's a culmination of probably 12 years of austerity in the UK that's kind of got people to a point now where it's kind of fight or bust. We've got to stand together and we've got to take industrial action, because otherwise we're going to lose our homes, etc., because we're not being paid enough.
Baking has undergone a massive cultural resurgence in the past few decades, and we've seen more cookbooks than ever available, thousands of recipes circulating the internet. How has this affected your line of work, if so?
It hasn't really. I mean, the industry as a whole, as I mentioned earlier, has changed. It's shrinking, but that's more due to automation. There's still a massive shortage of people baking their own bread at home. People will bake buns with the children, and they'll do meals for family and friends, but there's not a lot of people that are still baking bread. But the industry's adapting through to automation, and we think that that's going to get even more so after the pandemic, because machines don't get sick, whereas people do. So we're envisaging kind of another shrinkage with the traditional bakery side of the industry, and more automated machines coming in to make the cake that we all love and the bread. Which is why we've kind of started expanding into the fast food side of the food industry as well, where there's more exploitation there.
Kind of on the theme of automation and new technologies, the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union mission statement mentions new technologies and using them to improve the lives of food workers. What are some new technologies that are impacting your line of work, and how have they impacted food workers? So,
whilst I don't think we should have machines that do the whole process of making cake, because that reduces a line of 40-50 people to one person monitoring a piece of machinery, we've got members that their shift is boxing up cake or boxing up mince pies or Yorkshire puddings, and that can result in repetitive strain injury in the wrists and the shoulders and the back. So automating processes like those is positive because it reduces the risk to individuals. We've got, instead of lugging big boxes of cake or heavy packs of flour around. There's machines that now do that, which yes reduces the people in that space, but again it reduces the risk to their health. So in those respects, automation and machinery are positive because it's not damaging the people. But in other avenues like crumpet lines, one of my colleagues talks about when he first became an official, there would be 35 people on a crumpet line making crumpets. These days you're lucky if there's 3, and that's just because it's all now automated, which is reducing the opportunity for jobs in the industry. So we appreciate where technology supports and makes people safer, but when it's completely removing people from the industry, that can't be a good thing. We used to have like qualified bakers, so you would go do what was called a City and Guilds qualification, and then you would be a master baker. There is no bakers unless you're in like small artisan businesses. The machine operatives now, and that's such a shame.
What advice would you give to the younger generation to help support your line of work?
I think making choices about what you buy. So whilst we don't have a message that says boycott McDonald's because they use 0 hours contracts, because ultimately that means those workers will get less pay because there'll be less customers going in there and talking to people about unions. If there's an employer that, so Starbucks for example, we know Starbucks don't pay their taxes in the UK. So rather than go to Starbucks for a coffee, go to Greggs where you know it's unionised, because those workers are being looked after. Greggs pay the taxes and aren't kind of contributing to the whole global issue of capitalism as a result, and they're not exploiting the workers as much. And just make choices when you buy things and you think about things, and definitely when you start work, join a trade union.
And as a strong female leader, what advice would you give to younger girls wanting to go into leadership positions?
You need to develop a thick skin. People don't like young women telling them what to do. And, they don't. So you have to develop a thick skin, and I've not quite got there yet. I'm still developing that. And imposter syndrome is a massive thing. When you get to where you want to be, you deserve to be there because you've worked hard. And what I would say to anybody watching this is, I was a single mum at 17. I worked for Greggs. Right? If I didn't go to university because I had a baby, but if I can become the general secretary of a trade union at 35, anybody can do anything. Any young woman can think, I want to get there, and will get there. So just go for it, and don't let anybody tell you that you can't.